Now we're going to spend some time talking about American westward expansion into the American Southwest. Now, we're talking about this region, which includes Texas, Oklahoma, Arizona, and New Mexico. And as you can see, there are some really big environmental differences. As you go east to west, over in East Texas, you've got heavily forested areas, not unlike neighboring Louisiana. And then as you go westward, you go to prairie, and then plains, and then the high plains. And then you get up into the mountains, and an even drier area, even drier climate. Now, Oklahoma, we've already talked about expansion there, the expansion being all those Native American tribes from the east who were removed there. The western part of the state still being inhabited by the plains tribes like the Comanches and Kiowa. We'll talk about American U.S. expansion into western Oklahoma later. So right now we're going to be talking about Texas, and we're going to be talking about Arizona and New Mexico, and we're also going to be including California because, well, the southern part of California is in the southwest, but all these areas that I have circled here were controlled by the Spanish and then by Mexico, so they have that in common. In the desert southwest proper, that's the area here in the yellow, the Spanish had been in control since the early 1500s. Now, there were a lot of Puebloan tribes in that region, the Zuni and Hopi and others, and they had been dominated by the Spanish. Although there was a really successful effort in 1680 by the Pueblo of Santa Fe against their Spanish occupiers, in which they actually drove the Spanish out, and they stayed gone for about 20 years. And then they came back in greater force and took the area back over again. It was that rebellion, uprising, more accurately, that garnered a huge number of horses for the Pueblo. The Spanish had a large horse herd that they left behind when they ran off, and the Pueblos traded those horses, many of them, to their neighbors to the north, which is how they made their way out eventually onto the Great Plains. Now, in that yellow area, there were three other tribes that, well, let's just say broader than that, including part of Texas. Three other tribes that resisted the Spanish consistently, and then eventually in the early 1800s, around 1820, 1819, 1820, when the area transferred from Spain to Mexico, then these three tribes I'm going to talk about transferred their resistance from Spain to Mexico. I'm talking about the Comanches in the High Plains area of West Texas and western Oklahoma. And in the desert southwest, I'm talking about the Navajo and the Apache. So I have some representative photographs from the era here of the Comanches. I've got a typical Comanche family, as well as some Comanche warriors decked out in their regalia for war. As a plains tribe, the Comanches had the feathered headdresses and a lot of the horse culture and the buffalo and so forth associated with plains Indians. The Comanche name for themselves was Numunu, the people. Navajo name for themselves is Diné, which means the people. Navajo and Apaches speak an Athabascan language, similar to the Inuits up in Alaska. Comanches speak a Shoshonean dialect. They were originally part of the Shoshone tribe, and when they got horses, they had migrated southward. So you got the Navajos. You've also got the Apaches, and here is probably the most famous Apache on the far right, Geronimo, picture taken in the 1880s. The Apache name for themselves was Inde, which means the people. All three of these groups were resisting the Spanish and the Mexicans. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the regions that we're talking about and see what was going on there before the U.S. started expanding westward into those regions, particularly looking at the Native Americans of that region. So beginning with those Athabascan language groups that I just talked about, the Navajos and the Apaches. Got a nice map here showing the location of the different tribal groups in for Navajo. So that's where the Navajo were, up there in New Mexico and into part of Arizona. And then the various different Apache groups. The Icarilla, the Western Apache, Chiricahua, Mescalero, Lipan, and the Plains Apache, also known as the Kiowa Apache. They're way off, separate from the others, you'll notice, over in western Oklahoma. Now, most of the Apache groups had originally been in the Plains area. Well, they'd originally been up in Canada, and had migrated southward onto the plains and were driven off the plains by the Comanches when they showed up by the 1700s. But this one group of Apaches, the Kiowa Apache or Plains Apache, stayed in the region, and they were able to do that by allying themselves with the Kiowa tribe, which was a southern plains tribe, enemies of the Comanches at that time, but later close allies of them. So the Plains Apache maintained their language and culture, but lived among and shared other cultural traits with and territory with the Kiowa, so that they eventually would also, when the Kiowa allied with the Comanches in the 1800s, they would be their allies as well. So that's the location of the different groups. Overall, the area controlled by the Apaches, particularly in New Mexico and Arizona, was known as the Gran Apacheria by the Spanish. This was roughly where the boundaries of that reached by the late 1700s. So again, New Mexico, Arizona, pretty good ways down into Mexico, the westernmost part of Texas. Now, let's take a look at the Comanches. In the 1600s, they had been up in Wyoming, and they were a Shoshone division. Then after they got horses, they moved southward. By 1705, they were at the location where Kansas meets Colorado, and a little bit of Nebraska there, and continued going southward. In fact, some of them had arrived in Texas by as early as the 1740s, but by the 1800s, this area shows the location of the various Comanche bands and sort of the boundaries of the area that they controlled. So that was known to the Spanish as the Comancheria. By the way, Apache's name for themselves is Inde, but Apache comes from a neighboring tribe and means enemy. The Comanche name for themselves, as I said, was Numunu, which means the people, but Comanche comes from a neighboring tribe, a word meaning the enemy, or the people who fight us all the time. So you've got the Apacheria and the Comancheria, large spheres of influence of these two tribes. And you can see over there in the around what is now the border of West Texas and New Mexico, they kind of crossed. It's that Venn diagram. It's the Venn diagram of places you do not want to be, because there was conflict between the Apaches and the Comanches. And both Apaches and Comanches frequently raided the Mexican settlements in the area and sometimes farther south, taking livestock and scalps, and sometimes taking people as captives that sometimes they would sell. There was a pretty big slave trade going on in the American Southwest. Well, the Comanches had a trade empire. They initially allied themselves with the Wichitas and the Caddos. They're in Texas. Later on, I think 1830s, 1840s, I may be off on that, allied with the Kiowas, who had previously been their enemies. So there's several different Comanche bands. There was no centralized tribal leadership. There was not a chief over all the Comanches, just of the individual bands. Now, in Taos, New Mexico, in 1776, a visitor was able to write about the things that the Comanches brought in to trade. He said that they brought buffalo hides and white elk skins, horses and mules, buffalo meat, and, in the words of the witness, pagan Indians or captives that they had taken in their raids. New Mexico, after having, when it was part of Spain, eventually made peace with all three groups, the Comanches, Apaches, and Navajo, by 1790, a peace that pretty much continued for about 2 decades, until again the area was separated from Spain and became Mexico. California, as I mentioned, was also a Spanish colony that really, it was like the northernmost part of New Spain, which New Spain covered almost all of South America except Brazil, Central America, Mexico, the American Southwest, and California. So it was like a far-flung region, kind of a backwater to the capital at Mexico City. And the Spanish really didn't do too much in California for a long time, for, 250 years, really. They only finally started showing up there when the Russians started moving southward. The Russians, who had established first missionaries and then later trading posts and so forth in Alaska, attempted colonies in Alaska, moved down the west coast of British Columbia and what is now Washington and Oregon, and as far south as northern California, setting up forts and trading posts to engage in the otter fur trade. So as the Russians are starting to expand into California, then the government of New Spain realized, hey, we better put some people there or they'll try to take it away from us. And that's when they started establishing missions in California. The first one, San Diego in 1769, San Francisco in 1776, and then many more in the late 1700s. Looking at the native people of California, there were a lot of tribal groups. There were as many and maybe more tribal groups in California as in the whole rest of the American West put together. And part of this is because resources were so plentiful in California that it was able to sustain a lot of people. For the most part, they didn't practice corn agriculture there in central and northern California, but they instead ate a lot of acorns. You remember, they got those big, huge forests in California. So there were so many acorns that they could just easily be gathered and ground up into meal and flour. So here's these various tribes, very little agriculture, little previous contact before the late 1700s when the Spanish finally got there. little previous contact with the Europeans, no confederacies as existed in other parts of the country when you had several different tribes sort of banding together to defend themselves against other large groups of tribes, because again, and in part this is because resources were so plentiful, there wasn't a whole lot to fight about. Not to say that there wasn't some occasional fighting, but not as much as in other areas, until the Spanish got there. In all, the Spanish established 21 missions in California over the space of about 50 years. So the way the mission would work is that the mission building would be the center of what would develop into a little town, and also would be the center of worship, because the priests were there. They were accompanied by soldiers, and frequently that was followed up by Spanish settlers engaged in various business pursuits who might move into the area. And then there was the population of the local Indians, who were converted to Christianity, and once converted, essentially were attached to the mission and lived right there in the immediate environs of that mission building, and were expected to provide labor for the mission, as well as being sort of loaned out as free labor to various soldiers and other Spanish settlers. Now, the missions themselves, we can take a look here and see the ones that were established. They all, well, not all of them, but many of them, may have familiar names. Like, for example, the mission of the first mission, established in 1769, of San Diego de Alcala, today known as the city of San Diego. San Juan, San Gabriel, San Fernando, moving all the way up to at the northernmost part there, San Francisco Solano. There were two San Francisco Solano and San Francisco de Asís, formed in 1776, which is eventually going to be known just as San Francisco. There's also Santa Clara, San Jose. So you probably heard of most of those, cities that grew up where those missions had been. Of course, you are aware that San means saint in Spanish. So San Diego means St. James. San Francisco means St. Francisco. And Santa is the feminine form of saint. So you had Santa Barbara, for example. These missions and the priests who worked there had as their goal the salvation of Indian souls. And they believed that a dead Indian who had achieved salvation and went to heaven was much better off than a live Indian who was clinging to his traditional religious practices, in other words, a savage or a pagan. So the conditions, the living conditions for the Indians at these missions were pretty harsh, and if they tried to hold on to any semblance of their native religion, and even of their native culture in some cases, it was suppressed by the priests, with the soldiers being used to do the suppressing. Now, in addition to that, it was just common for there to be wholesale rapes of native women by those Spanish soldiers and settlers, who brought with them socially transmitted diseases, especially syphilis and gonorrhea, which spread like wildfire through the native populations of California and killed a lot of people. These women would be raped and then would return home to their husbands and families and transmit the diseases to their husbands, and so it would affect a lot of people. Now this is all sad, but one of the sad parts is we're talking about during the Spanish occupation and early Mexican period. Later on, in the late 1840s, early 1850s, when you started seeing more Anglos, or people from the United States, showing up, this situation got much, much worse. Now, this guy, Junipero Serra, was the Franciscan priest who was in charge overall of all the missions in California. He was canonized as a saint by the Catholic Church in 2015, and that met with vigorous protest from Native American people in California, to whom Serra is anything but a saint. They felt like, and continue to feel, that in a way this was a justification of the treatment that their ancestors received by canonizing the guy in charge of it. Now, at these missions, there were acts of resistance. It's kind of similar to the situation with slavery in the American South. Most of the resistance was kind of a nonviolent, passive resistance, in the sense of not working as hard as the people forcing you to work wanted you to, finding ways around that, maybe finding ways to sabotage things. But there was also some direct and violent resistance, beginning in 1775, just 6 years after that first mission in San Diego had been established, when the native peoples there rose up and killed several people, including one of the priests. That was the first of about a dozen uprisings at the missions over that 50-year period. The biggest one happened at Santa Barbara, the Chumash Revolt. That's one of the California tribes. This one was very highly organized. They managed to take control of the mission building from inside without any bloodshed at that point. And then they sort of held out there until the Mexican army arrived. By this point, it had changed from being Spanish possession to Mexican possession, and most of the Chumash fled to the surrounding hills, and it took several days for the Mexican army to be able to suppress this revolt. There were about 2,000 Indians involved, and about 300 Mexican soldiers, who obviously were very heavily armed compared to the resisting Indians. Well, there were also missions in Texas and other areas, and we're going to be talking about one of those missions in particular later on. But first, let us introduce Texas and look at the native peoples of that area. So here are the principal tribes that were located circa 1800 in Texas. I say principal tribes. There were some smaller ones, some smaller bands that did not have as much influence or as many numbers as these did. And by the way, I would point out that where it says Apache, that is specifically the Mescalero Apache. This was the easternmost part of their territory. Where it says Lipan, or as it was Americanized, Lipan, that is the Lipan Apache. So Lipan also are Apaches. The Comanches we've talked about a little bit already. We will be talking a whole lot more about Comanches and Apaches. Probably won't talk too much more about these other groups. So let's take a look at them and what was going on with them at this time period in the early Mexican period, essentially. The Coahuiltecan were hunter-gatherers, and they were absorbed by the Spanish by the 1820s, essentially either killed off or intermarried, and sort of becoming Spanish, culturally Spanish and later Mexican, So they no longer were a factor after about 1820. Then you had the Karankawa, whom the American settlers would later refer to as Kronks. You had the Karankawa and the Tonkawa, and the early the early Anglo-Texans called them Kronks and Tonks. So the Karankawa did not get absorbed by the Spanish. They remained a distinct group, and they had an unfair reputation, I think, that most historians today would agree, that there were all these stories about them being cannibals, and widely believed stories by the early Anglo settlers, and therefore that charge frequently appeared in even historical works about the Karankawa in the 19th and 20th century. But now there's been some doubt cast on whether that's actually kind of an exaggeration. The Tonkawa tended to be very cooperative with the new arrivals, the Spanish at first, then later the Americans. And in fact, they were referred to by the early Anglo-Texans as government Indians because they sided with the Texas government, later the U.S. government, when the U.S. annexed Texas. That didn't help them. In 1859, they were removed to Oklahoma, where so many other tribes had already been removed by that point, because Texas was growing and Texans wanted their land. The Caddo were a pretty big tribe, and what we're seeing here is just a portion of their territory. The larger number of them were in Louisiana and Arkansas, and their territory kind of extended outward into what is now East Texas. So East Texas, I think I mentioned this before, the climate there, the geography there is very similar to Louisiana. It's just an extension of it because what's the difference between East Texas and Louisiana? An imaginary line. That's it. The Caddo and the Wichita were both remnants of the Mississippian culture. That was that highly structured, hierarchical structure, very similar to the nations and empires in Central and South America that had mostly disappeared by the 1700s. Most of the tribes that Hernando de Soto discovered in the 1540s that he encountered, most of the tribes he encountered in the American South were Mississippian, but there had been so much disease that accompanied the De Soto expedition. Most of those cultures were almost wiped out, and they had to reform, so they were in a much simpler form when Europeans encountered them again. But the Caddo escaped that. The Caddo and the Natchez in Louisiana and the Wichita, they escaped that because the De Soto expedition didn't pass through that area. It started just east of them. So the Caddo tended to be agricultural. They were sedentary. They tended to be cooperative with the Texans, but because particularly earlier on in the late 1700s, early 1800s, they had been allied, the Caddo and the Wichita, with the Comanches, primarily being the Comanches' trade partners. But they were associated closely with Comanches by the people in the early Republic of Texas, blamed often for things that the Comanches had done. It didn't matter one way or the other. Just like the Tonkawa, they were removed to Oklahoma in 1859. Now, one more group that we'll look at is the Cherokees of Texas. Now, Cherokees are not native to Texas. In fact, I remember when I was younger reading about Sam Houston. We talked about Sam Houston in the context of his grievous wound, I think, earlier. We'll be talking a lot more about him soon. But I remember reading that Sam Houston had spent a lot of time with the Texas Cherokees. And being from Tennessee, I always had associated Cherokees with Tennessee and North Carolina. And I found it odd that they were so far away. Well, there's a reason for that. They hadn't been there very long. The Cherokees who were in Texas were a part of the groups that in the 18 teens, starting around 1817 or so, had taken the U.S. government up on its offer and the state's offers of giving them land west of the Mississippi if they would give up their lands east of the Mississippi. And so some of them took that deal immediately and headed west, initially to Arkansas. And the largest group of those that wound up in Texas was led by this guy, the Bowl, who is also known as Chief Bowles, like a last name, but initially the Bowl, who was one of the Chickamauga Cherokee. He was one of the leaders of the Chickamaugas in the latter part of the Chickamauga Wars. You'll notice he was born in 1765, so that means that he was in his late 20s at the climax of the Chickamauga Wars. Well, he led his people to Arkansas, and then more and more white people moved to Arkansas and started wanting to make it a state and wanted the lands that these early Cherokee immigrants had accepted. So they were forced out of there, and they went to, instead of going to Oklahoma, which was part of U.S. territory that had been bought from France, they went into Mexican territory, the territory of Texas. Now, Texas, by the way, called by the Spanish Tejas, which was the Spanish pronunciation of the Caddo word Tesha, which means friend or ally. The Caddos, remember, they were pretty cooperative with the Spanish, and were, their allies, and so that's how the word Texas came into being. These Cherokees went into northeastern Texas and lived there for about a quarter of a century. They were part of that group called the Old Settlers. Most of the Old Settlers had gone from Arkansas then into eastern Oklahoma. The Bowl led his group down into Texas, and the Mexicans were happy to have them there because they preferred a buffer against the raids of the Comanches, who were very problematic for the Mexicans. And in fact, that bringing in settlers to sort of, in an under-the-table kind of way, provide a buffer against the raiding Comanches, so they'd have to raid these people first. Pretty soon after the Cherokees arrived in Texas, that role started to also be played by Anglos, by people from the United States who were invited in, as we shall see, and who also the Mexican government was hoping would be the people the Comanches killed first, and that would distract them from killing Mexicans. During the war for Texas independence, spoiler alert, we'll be talking about that in just a little bit, the Cherokees stayed neutral. They didn't take sides. After the Texans established their independence and declared themselves an independent country, spoiler alert, the Cherokees were driven out by the Texas Army. Now, it didn't happen immediately because the first president of Texas was Sam Houston, and he had spent a lot of time living among those Texas Cherokees, and he was quite fond of them. He had developed friendships with Cherokees all the way back in the Creek War, where he got that grievous wound. The president after him of Texas, though, was not as well disposed toward Cherokees, and he did, in fact, chase them out, despite the protests of the now out-of-office Sam Houston. So they wound up fleeing from Texas and going to eastern Oklahoma and joining with the other old settlers. So if you remember from a couple of lectures ago when we talked about the Trail of Tears, those old settlers were in place when the Ridge Party showed up, and then later the majority of the Cherokee Nation was forcibly removed. So by that time, the Cherokees were there, or just arriving. Actually, the Bull had passed away by then. Had a pretty long life. All right, well, that sets us up for talking about the the westward expansion of the United States into Texas. Now that we have looked at the native peoples who were there, so let's talk now about Tejas.